Greetings, everyone. My name is Sarah Barnes, and on behalf of Campbell Company, I'd like to welcome you to campaign preparation, dotting your I's and crossing your T's. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly review some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. One is close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. Secondly, call in using a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. If you can, move your cell phone away from your computer. And then finally, if you experience any visual issues, you can send a chat to Campbell Company or contact GoTo directly at 1-800-263-6317. Finally, our webinar will last 60 minutes and you will earn 1 continuing education credit, and that is good for certification with CFRE International. About an hour after the webinar, you will receive an email from GoToWebinars that includes a web address to download your certificate and a PDF of our presentation. And now I would like to quickly introduce Craig Hightower to you. Craig is a Vice President and Director of our Western region at Campbell Company. He has worked with a variety of TNC chapters around the country, the Charles Darwin Foundation, San Diego Zoo Global, Yosemite Conservancy, and a variety of other environmental organizations. And I'm very excited to hand it over to Craig, who's going to give you an introduction of Jake. Craig?
Great, thank you, Sarah. Jake, actually, do you want to give a self-introduction too? Jake and I have known each other for quite a few years now, actually, working together with the Nature Conservancy. But do you want to give a little quick snapshot of your background, Jake?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, as it may be. I'm Jake DeMoe. I'm the Deputy Director of Philanthropy for the Nature Conservancy in California. I've been with the Nature Conservancy for about 8 years. Prior to the Conservancy, I was the Director of Development for the Western States at the Environmental Defense Fund. I was the Director of Development for the School of Engineering at UC Berkeley. I also spent some time with the Trust for Public Land, KQED. I've been fundraising for about 25 years.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate it. I'm going to tee stuff up, and then we'll hear from Jake in a couple of seconds here. So what we wanted to cover today is Jake's going to give you a quick background on the Nature Conservancy in California. And we're going to tell you a little bit about what they did to prepare for the campaign they are currently in. And then Jake's going to kind of talk about where they are now and what they see as some of the challenges ahead. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions at the very end. But before we jump into this, we want to do a couple of really quick polls. They should jump up on your screen here quickly. The first one is, how many of you are thinking about launching a campaign? We're just kind of interested in just kind of getting a sense of who's out there in the audience as well, and whether you're currently in a campaign or thinking about starting a campaign. And if you just take 2 seconds or so, and on your screen it should be blue right now, and you can say yes or no.
All right. Here we are.
Wow. Okay, a lot of people gearing up for a campaign. Very interesting. The next poll, what we'd like to do is take another quick poll, and how many of you are currently in a campaign? If 88%, I guess we're thinking about it, then probably the rest are in one, possibly. And also, again, if there's questions, there's a little button off to the right that says chat. So if, as we're going along through this, you have some particular questions you want to do, if you type that question, Sarah will feed those questions back to us so we can answer your questions as we go along. Plus, we should have some time at the very end to do that. Okay, interesting. So about a bunch of people are in campaigns as well. All right, well, to tee stuff off, I'm going to pass it over to Jake for a minute and so he can tell you a little bit about the Nature Conservancy in California, and the Nature Conservancy is the larger entity as well.
Great, thanks, Craig. Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about the Conservancy. It is the largest environmental organization in the world. We're over 60 years old. We have an annual budget, an annual global budget of on the order of $450 million. We have 3,500 staff approximately, active in all 50 states and in 60 plus countries. Some of our proudest accomplishments, we've protected more than 120 million acres worldwide, which is an area roughly the size of California. We are the owner of the largest network of private nature preserves in the world, and including many working lands. So think farms, ranches, forests, etc. We own stuff. That's one of the defining attributes of the Nature Conservancy. We recently, right here in California, oversaw the fastest recovery of a mammal in the history of the Endangered Species Act, which is the island fox, which lives on Santa Cruz Island, which we own, and other Channel Islands down off the coast of Southern California. Each Conservancy chapter has its own board, state director, development staff, scientists, etc. All of those chapters roll up under the same 501c3 corporate umbrella, which is headquartered in Arlington, Virginia. I believe the California chapter is the largest of the chapters. We have an annual budget of roughly $55 million. We have 210 staff here in California, of which about 35 are development officers. And the Conservancy writ large is currently in the middle of a $4 billion 7-year private philanthropy campaign. Each chapter is at various stages of campaign readiness. California was actually ahead of the World Office in campaign planning and implementation, which was good in some ways and challenging in others. Our campaign priorities include our major focus areas, which are climate, freshwater, land, oceans, and cities. Fundraising support from our national office is similar to that that's provided by, say, central services, like in the university setting. So, in other words, the national office runs the membership program or annual fund, if you will, the proceeds of which are sent to the chapters. The national office also supports planned giving and principal gifts in each of the chapters and provides prospect research support as well as database support. For California, the California fundraising team, so our primary focus is on major gifts, which we define as gifts of $100,000 or more. We raise roughly $37 million a year from individuals, foundation, corporations, of which about 40% of that stays here in California to support conservation efforts here. About 35% of that funding goes to support international conservation priorities, and then the rest goes to support conservation in other states, because California is a major market for the entire Conservancy, and we have a lot of donors who want to contribute to Alaska, Idaho, Hawaii, those kinds of things. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that gives you a sense for the Nature Conservancy, and turn it back over to you, Craig.
Great, thanks, Jake. So our work with the Nature Conservancy this most recent time started back in 2012. At the time, there was a new director of philanthropy that had come in, and she inherited a really strong team. I mean, as what you just heard from Jake, I mean, they raise a lot of money, and they're very seasoned professionals. But she just kind of wanted to get a little sense: are we doing everything right? Is there any tweaking we need to do to our program? And so she brought us in to do a development audit. And so, just a couple of contextual factors that were in play at the time. The chapter has an amazing board. They're very strong, very generous. They're very connected up and down the state. The chapter also has a really robust, as Jake was just mentioning, really robust individual and institutional major giving program with really deep established relationships. And the chapter had also just completed a strategic planning process. So all really positive things. But despite those clear strengths, there were also some challenges. So that, although the chapter has a very strong and generous board, the staff wasn't really leveraging them to help with solicitations. And then, although the chapter has this incredible case for support, it was a bit daunting because they had at the time 9 different priorities, and often both the volunteers and staff couldn't even remember what all of the 9 were. And if you even talked with a donor about all 9, it was just a little overwhelming. And I think some of you probably have read the book, Jim Collins' book, The Good to Great. Well, in his book, he kind of remarked that if you actually have more than 3 priorities, you actually don't have any priorities at all. And that was a point we kept hammering with the Nature Conservancy as they were beginning to put their case together for their campaign. They also have a very strong development staff, but many of the development staff were leaving the chapter for other growth opportunities. Mostly it was going to other opportunities within the TNC network, but it was very disruptive both to the chapter and to the donor relationships. And although they have really good, well-cultivated donor relationships. Most of their donors were still giving well below capacity, and we'll get into what we felt various factors were that why that was going on. And then they also didn't have current wealth screening data to draw from, and their database was just extraordinarily cumbersome, which has now been fixed, thankfully. But it was really difficult to track the donor cultivation activity. So in our final report, after we did the development assessment, we made the following overarching recommendations. On the next slide, thank you. So our number one thing we recommended to them is to launch a campaign. And there were a lot of reasons why we felt it was important that they be in campaign mode. We felt the biggest reason was they weren't really articulating a big enough vision that would attract transformational giving. So their program was really set up on kind of an annual giving basis, so they were getting annual major gifts, but they had people with enormous capacity who loved the Nature Conservancy, but the development officers didn't have something big enough to sell to them. And we believe that, you know, people give big gifts to big visions, and they just didn't have that big vision out there to do. We also felt that being in campaign mode would provide them both the structure and the momentum they needed to advance their fundraising program for the long term. So we felt the campaign would help really build their program, and it would have a huge impact for years after the campaign was completed. And then ultimately, we felt that the campaign would help them be able to link what they're doing locally to what was going on in other states, which was going on internationally, because we knew a lot of the donors really enjoyed the fact that we discovered something here in California that now could be replicated in other states or around the world. We also felt that they needed to provide a professional growth path for their major gift officers. So at the time, they had kind of a two-tiered structure. There was one structure that was major gift officers. They happened to call them Associate Directors of Philanthropy, or ADOPS. And then they had donor relationship managers. And the concept was that the donor relationship managers would cultivate and develop relationships, and as they would get more developed, they would pass them up to the major gift officers. And we felt like, you know, if they were actually developing really good relationships, why wouldn't that donor relationship manager keep that relationship, because the donor always already connecting with them. And as well, the donor relationship managers didn't really want to give up those relationships to ADOPS. And so what we suggested was that that they don't have a two-tier system, that everyone becomes an Associate Director of Philanthropy, but there was a tiered system. So there was an ADOP 1, an ADOP 2, an ADOP 3, and the advancement for them was sort of driven by themselves. To be a benchmark to advance from an ADOP 1 to an ADOP 2, here are the benchmarks you need to reach. And from a 2 to a 3, here's the benchmarks you need to reach. So in some respects, the major gift officers would have control over their own destiny, and we had hoped that that might be a way to help keep and retain many of the staff who were leaving for better opportunities elsewhere within the network or elsewhere outside. We also suggested that they do a wealth screening and begin to rebalance their portfolios, and we'll get into that in a minute or two. And then finally, we recommended that they involve their board in solicitations and cultivations. So as we began the campaign preparation process, thanks, Becca. In the summer of 2013, the chapter's board, after we presented the findings from the development audit, they voted to move forward with the campaign planning process. They recruited a campaign planning committee to lead that process. That committee was comprised of board members. But the one caveat is they really pushed back hard on staff and said, we want to know what's different at the end of this campaign. How is this campaign really going to have an impact? So they don't just want a traditional feasibility study where we go out there. They want to say, you know, what are the conservation results at the end and what's going to be achieved? So while our firm took on the philanthropic assessment piece of it, the staff began to launch a very complex mapping of the needs and the results. So in all, the organization identified an overall need of about $300 million, give or take a couple of million. But that also included about $90 million for raising money for what they did in international programs and also programs in other states. All of this work took about 18 months. And the committee did regularly report outs to the full board at every meeting. and it ultimately resulted in a campaign plan that was adopted by the board in May of 2014. So at that board meeting, they went through the needs assessment that was presented to the board. And to get to this point, the development team literally went from department to department, asking the scientists, the department heads, what they were working on, how much it cost, what projects they had on the horizon, and they wanted to be doing what they wanted to be doing that they couldn't be doing due to lack of funding. So in all, it added up to about $350 million in projects. You'll also note that this slide that there's a section here earmarked calling emerging initiatives for $88 million. They felt there would be issues on the horizon that none of us really were able to articulate now or to foresee, and they wanted to be able to provide resources for such of the issues. So that was, for lack of a better term, kind of the slush fund. But even after all the hard work that went into getting them to this point, they quickly discovered that actually the hard part had just actually begun. So they began what we called a bucketing exercise. And so again, remembering that there were 9 priorities they started with. And as they have this massive spreadsheet that Jake and team developed that were just multiple pages long, they tried to figure out what's common thread between all of those and how could they organize each of these together. So the next step was the staff to go through this very arduous process of consolidating all these priorities into similar buckets. And again, we were pushing really hard on having minimum of 3 priorities. As Jake mentioned in the beginning, the national or the world office actually has several more than that 3, but at least it was substantially less than 9. But this wasn't a simple process. Many of the priorities actually kind of fell into several different buckets, or some of them were cross-cutting concepts that kind of went through all 3 of these buckets. But eventually they landed on the 3 major areas that were land, water, and oceans. So the next process was we took all these priorities and put them into this, what we called a campaign vision statement, which basically summarized the various goals. We used this document to engage the donors in conversations about where TNC was going, and we wanted to elicit donor input on that vision. So through this process, we tested the viability. At the time, we were using a $350 million test goal. We conducted about 60 phone interviews. We did 50 face-to-face conversations. 25 of them our Campbell Company consultants did. 25 of them the Nature Conservancy staff did, and we gave them questionnaire and kind of walked them through what the process would be. And then we also did an email survey, and we had about 800 responses back from that survey. So as a result of this donor engagement process, we determined that we felt that they could be successful in a $350 million campaign that ran about a 5-year campaign. It looked doable on paper, but the board still was a little bit nervous, that they still had a bit of cultivating and stewarding of donors to do. So ultimately, the campaign planning committee recommended that they go with a $275 million goal, which is what Jake was describing, but you'll see they've had huge success with that so far. And that still represented about a 60% increase in the major and principal gifts over what they had raised in the prior 5 years. So this was still a very aspirational goal, but they still felt it was very doable. So while the staff was working through that whole process on the case, we also reviewed, they have about 625,000 records in the California TNC database. So they retained target analytics to conduct a predictive modeling exercise. It looked at what their top donors had in common. It looked at the demographic and giving history, such as consecutive years of giving or age, education, household income, property value, etc. And target analytics then provided them with some wealth scores for their top donors. So then our analytics team took this data and then we separated them into 2 categories. We said the first category were prospects. These are people that we felt had the inclination and the capacity to give and were cultivated enough that they might be able to give over the next 5 years during this campaign period. Then the second bucket were future prospects. Future prospects still had significant capacity, but they were just more distanced from the Nature Conservancy maybe hadn't given in a couple of years, so they were future prospects, and it may take more work to get them moved along. So in all, the first list, which was a prospect list, we identified 3,800 prospects who both had a strong giving and inclination rating, but also have the capacity to make a gift of $100,000 and above. So the following slide will show you kind of the results of that evaluation. So the 3,800 donors were grouped by giving capacity. So you'll see there's 600 at $1 million plus, 400 at 500 plus, et cetera. And these are all deemed to have strong inclination to give to the Nature Conservancy in California. And all this group had an overall philanthropic giving capacity, and that isn't just to the Nature Conservancy, it's giving capacity to any charities or all charities, but an overall philanthropic giving capacity of about $8 billion. In addition, there were the future prospect list that we looked at, and there were about 12,000 future prospects that also scored very high, but they weren't as close to the Nature Conservancy as the others, and it would take definitely more time to cultivate, but that group represented an additional philanthropic giving capacity of about $10 billion. So then we took it, and on the next slide, we took this and we conducted what we call a gap analysis. So what you see on your screen is a typical gift table. This represents how many gifts they would need to raise at the various levels in order to be successful in raising the $275 million goal that the board voted to move forward with. And it says then how many prospects, the needed column is how many prospects they would need to give at the various levels. So then this chart, what it does is overlay the number of prospects that are needed with the number of prospects that were identified. So in the $25 million category, they needed 4, they've identified 82, and then the delta ultimately is 78. So what you can see is the good news is they are very prospect rich. Unfortunately, the bad news is what we found on the next slide. So of the 3,800 prospects that were identified, only 21% of them were currently being managed by the development staff. So, and of those who were being managed by the development staff, 11% of them were rated with giving capacity of under $100,000. And then there was another 10% that were deemed less likely. That was the future prospects. So again, those are the ones that, that we felt were farther away. So what all that meant was they needed to take a very careful look at rebalancing their portfolios. So on the next slide, we're going to show you where those efforts were focused. So let me help you orient the slide. So down the left side, we're depicting the gift capacity of the donors. So you see the 1 million plus category, the 100,000 plus category, and then under 100,000. So then the red bar represents those prospects who are currently under management. So red is good. The tan bar represents those with high inclination, again, our prospect group, who are not currently in the portfolios. So the two areas of focus would be to move the tan people, that's the 288 of them at the $1 million plus level, and then the 2,664 of them at the $100,000 plus level into managed portfolios. And at the same time, we would probably want to move those prospects with capacity of less than 100,000 out of portfolios. And then the orange represents those future prospects who, again, are the prospects that have capacity, but just are going to take more time to cultivate. So that's basically it for the background. I'm going to pass it to Jake so he can tell you what they did with this information and how ultimately they implemented our recommendations. Jake?
And Craig, this is Sarah. As we go
Sure.
into this, we did have a question about donors earning less than $100,000 per year and if there was an approach for them. So however,
you know, that might be a good question as I'm passing it to Jake, but quite frankly, they had so many prospects that were giving at those levels that needed to be the focus, especially for this campaign. But the World Office and California really led the way, and this is looking at what they call a middle donor program, that is that. I'm not sure any of the chapters have really identified the perfect solution to that yet, but I think Jake can probably tell you a little bit more about the middle donor program also.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. The folks that are rated under 100,000 are managed in fact, many of the 3,800 that you looked at are managed by our membership program. So they are actively managed, they're being solicited. It is a direct marketing approach. There are other segments too. We have, as Craig mentioned, a middle donor program. We need to invest more in that, but we do have folks who are developing strategies for middle donors. We have a legacy club, which is a gift planning society. So there are other segments that we as a whole need to pay attention to. What Craig, I think, is really zeroing in on is where the California chapter as a major gifts operation could really move the needle. So picking up on the recommendation there that Campbell and Company gave us that we ought to rebalance our portfolios, here's how it played out. In this slide, beige is good, red is bad, and gray is okay. And what we're talking about, I think an important point to keep in mind here, is a universe of roughly 1,000 managed prospects. That's about what the California program can manage. We have about 10 out-the-door individual giving fundraisers. So these pie charts show how those 1,000 managed donors are segmented by capacity and by engagement. The chart on the left shows where we started at the outset of the campaign, and the chart on the right is where we ended up after about an 8-month exercise, where we utilized all that data that Craig was just walking you through to disqualify about 250 poorly-ish rated prospects, which are those in the red on the left side there. And we replaced those with highly rated but unmanaged prospects that were identified, as you saw, through the screening. The people that we disqualified were moved back into the membership pool, I think kind of picking up on that question, or in some cases into, again, the Legacy Club, which is our gift planning society. You'll notice that on the right side, we're still managing some red-rated prospects, and part of that is because we still have some work to do, honestly. It's not always easy for fundraisers to stop managing donors that they've been managing for years, even though those donors are only capable of, making annual gifts. There are also some VIPs in that group, former trustees, that kind of thing, who don't have capacity to make a major gift. But overall, we're confident that we're now focusing largely on our best prospects, and we feel really good about that. So we made some good progress. I think what's striking when you consider the slides that Craig was just showing you is how many really good-looking prospects we weren't able to manage given our staffing constraints. So at that point in 2014, at that point in our plan, we began to see the need to hire additional campaign staff, which is never an easy case to make, right? But when you consider that we had done a few key things. Number one, we had rebalanced our portfolios to focus on the best prospects that we could. We had recalibrated expectations of our fundraisers, and you'll see some of that a little bit later. And we built those new performance metrics in to our fundraising program. And we also had the data to show that we were still unable to get to some of our best prospects. So we had a pretty strong case for staffing up. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that in the end we were successful in getting 5 additional positions approved. What you're looking at here is the staffing timeline that we proposed to our state director. If you look closely, you might see that this slide actually shows that there were 7 positions that were proposed, but we were given approval for 5. And with that approval, we were able to hire 2 out-the-door fundraisers, as well as a writer and a researcher and an admin position. And that package of staff, if you will, I think is important. One of the key components of our case for staffing up was that, we really wanted to emphasize with our state director that you can't just hire out-the-door fundraisers. You need to build support around those fundraisers in the form of prospect research and admin support and writing capacity and those kinds of things. And yes, in case you're wondering, we did build in as well revenue targets for those new fundraisers at the range of $1 to $2 million per fundraiser per year. I guess one thing you guys would like to highlight is how transparent we were with our board and our senior staff about the state of our fundraising operations throughout the planning process, because honestly, it's a little scary presenting them with information that showed, for example, that we weren't always focused on the best prospects, or maybe that we weren't meeting with many of the prospects in our portfolios at all, or that we were spending a lot of time on low-ish capacity donors, for example. What we found in the survey is that some of our donors felt like we weren't stewarding them well, those kinds of things. But we shared all that information with our board and our senior leadership, and I think what it did is it built a level of trust and sort of a partnership between our fundraising team and the board, and also with our senior staff. So taking all that pre-work into account, as Craig mentioned, our board approved a $275 million 5-year campaign. Next slide, please. What you see here is the board resolution that officially launched the campaign in May of 2014. And it was a great accomplishment, right? We were really excited about it. We had done all this prep work, and we finally launched our campaign. The board approved it. What became apparent pretty quickly, though, was that even though our board and senior team were behind the campaign, and even though we had articulated, as Craig was talking about, a solid set of conservation outcomes that we were trying to accomplish, we still didn't have a compelling, cohesive set of materials, case for support, that we could arm our fundraisers with and share with donors. And so that kind of brings me to the next wave of work that we embarked on. So if you go to the next slide.
Jake, I think Sarah has got a question before you jump into the case piece about the staffing.
Yeah, we just had a couple questions regarding the number of positions added, and that it seemed that the 3.1 million just seemed a little bit high for the number of staff that were added. Can you just clarify that a little bit?
The 3.1 million?
Yeah, I think it was in the 2 slides before.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. That's over the life of the campaign, and it's for 7 staff positions over the life of the campaign. So it's not an annual. Yeah. Got it. It's not an annual need. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. So our next task, right, was to really arm our fundraisers and board with a compelling suite of campaign materials. And here's a snapshot of some of those materials. We also built out a campaign website. It took us about a year to produce these, and to be honest, it was frustratingly slow. I think a couple of key factors that contributed to that, and maybe you guys can relate here, is that first, as Craig was mentioning, the chapter, as soon as we launched the campaign, the chapter reorganized almost immediately. We went from having 3 eco-regions and 6 priority initiatives, right, 9 things, to organizing the chapter around 3 core programs, land, water, and oceans, which was really nice in some ways. I mean, having 3 priorities is much simpler, it's more elegant than 9, and it aligned us well with the global organization. But at the same time, we hadn't yet created a new strategic plan that underpinned that new reorg, and so it meant that we were trying to create campaign materials without having a revised, kind of updated strategic plan in place, which is really backwards when you think about it. So in effect, the process of creating the campaign case was then married to the process for creating a conservation vision and strategic plan for the chapter. My guess is that's not terribly unusual. Again, maybe some of you can relate, but it's slow, and it was frustrating for our fundraisers who wanted to go out and make campaign asks but didn't have, materials to support the ask, and we also wanted to support our board in providing them with materials, etc. I will say, though, on the bright side, I guess, is that as a result, our board was very involved at every step in creating these materials and the campaign website. They were involved in weighing in on the vision, the goals, the outcomes. So they were engaged and feeling ownership, which is, exactly what we need and what we wanted. So bear with me here for a minute, and I'll walk you through the Nature Conservancy's campaign case at a high level so you can kind of see where we landed. If you can go to the next slide. The basic problem statement, if you will, that we're setting up is that, as I mentioned earlier, the Nature Conservancy has protected, about 120 million acres worldwide, which is an area the size of California. We're really proud of that. That's a tremendous accomplishment. And yet, all you really have to do is pick up a newspaper or talk to scientists, and you realize that all of the indicators that we care about most, from the health of forests, rivers, streams, oceans, you name it, almost all those indicators are going in the wrong direction. Next slide. So this realization has really led the Conservancy to say, hey, as the largest conservation organization in the world, we really have a responsibility to go beyond protecting individual places and to solve some of the big environmental problems facing the world today. When you think about climate change or drought or extinction, these are really daunting challenges. And how do we get there? How does the Nature Conservancy help, And the answer is the Conservancy cannot do it alone. It's pretty obvious, I think, to all of us, but what we really have to do is make conservation relevant to people, especially the people who control vast amounts of natural resources. So think about timber companies, ranchers, farmers, fishermen, that kind of thing. So the Conservancy is sort of saying, hey, our job here is to use science and our huge network of nature preserves, stuff that we own, to demonstrate real-life solutions that prove to the world that people and nature thrive together, so that those big resource users can become agents of change themselves by adopting these same kind of practices on their own land. So that sounds good, But what does it really mean? Let me give you a couple of examples. Next slide. Some of you may know that over 1 billion people around the world depend on fish as a primary source of protein. But unfortunately, destructive fishing practices have really put our oceans at risk. Right now, 90% of the world's large fish are already gone. And the people who have the best chance to fix these problems are the ones most directly affected by them, which are fishing communities like this one here in this photo in Half Moon Bay. So our big idea is to help fishermen there become agents of change and restore our oceans. We've already, by the way, proven this is possible in California, where we worked with fishermen here in Half Moon Bay and Morro Bay and elsewhere, where over a 10-year period, we transformed what was a collapsing, low-profit, high-volume fishery into a high-profit, low-volume fishery almost overnight in a period of about 10 years. And through this campaign, this is what we're setting up, Through this campaign, we will use this same approach to transform at least 90% of California's fisheries and pilot those same approaches to sustainable fisheries in the five of the largest fishing countries on the planet. Next slide. Just one more example, folks. Right here in California, in the Central Valley, we're working with farmers to flood their fields at very precise times of year to provide pop-up wetland habitat for migratory birds on the Pacific Flyway. And you may know the Pacific Flyway is that super highway of birds that travel from the Arctic through California on their way down to South and Central America. But when they land here, when those birds land here in California, what they find is that 95% of the historic wetlands have been lost to development. So the Conservancy's goal through this campaign is to work with farmers to protect 1 million acres of bird-friendly habitat in California's Central Valley, which will still only be about 25% of the historic total, but it represents a 4x increase over what those migratory birds have today. Next slide. So those are a couple of examples, right, of the Conservancy's work. But our goal for this campaign isn't just to protect migratory birds or ocean fisheries. It's really to fundamentally transform the way conservation is done by proving out solutions that work for people and nature, and then replicating those solutions in other places around the world. So that's how we're going to achieve conservation at scale, right? And that's the theory of change behind this campaign. Next slide. And that's why. So that's our case in a nutshell, right, folks? Thank you for bearing with me there. There's a lot more I could say. Obviously, I wouldn't walk a donor through it in exactly that way, but hopefully it gives you a sense for the messaging that we developed with our conservation and science staff, with our board, as a team, that the whole chapter could really rally around. And you know, I want to give a shout out, by the way, to Andy Brommel and Pat Chestnut on the Campbell team who helped us develop this messaging. Next slide. Okay, so we developed that case. Where are we now? You know, fast forward a few years, 2 years actually. Here's where we are as of January 31st, 2017. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some of our dashboards and how we're measuring success. We've raised $224.5 million at this point towards our $275 million goal. So we are 81.6% precisely of goal, at about 71% of the way into the campaign. So we're on track. The upper right-hand side of this chart shows sources of funds, including, you know, membership and bequest revenue. Because this is a comprehensive campaign, we're counting all gifts. And at the bottom of the chart, you can see uses of funds by land, water, oceans, etc. Kind of hearkening back to some of Craig's comments, one positive trend that I'd like to point out at the very bottom of this chart, which shows flexible, unrestricted funding that we're raising. As you know, that's the best kind of funding, right? And historically, the Conservancy had a track record of asking for really highly restricted gifts at the $1 million+ level for things like specific land acquisitions, for example. But this campaign and this case for support is really helping us to frame a broader ask for lightly restricted or even unrestricted gifts. And, you know, I'm happy to report that we are finding some success with that. Next slide. This slide is what we affectionately refer to as our airplane seating chart. It's essentially our $275 million gift table, and we fill in the boxes once we raise those gifts. So the red and green boxes, by the way, represent gifts from our volunteers, our trustees, and our leadership council. On the top right of this slide, you can see some additional measures that we're tracking on, such as the number of major donors, the number of new in-will notifications or bequest intentions, and the % participation by our board in planned giving. On that one, you can actually see that we still have some work to do on that front. Next slide, please. And then a real wonky internal slide for all of you out there. This provides a snapshot of our fiscal year progress, so 1 year, for the entire California fundraising team. We have 10 individual major gift fundraisers and an additional 4 corporate and foundation relation fundraisers. So on the left side, you can see how the performance of that whole team rolls up. And on the right side are the fundraising results year to date, which we're right now midway. Our fiscal year extends from July through June, so we're at about the midpoint. And again, on the right side there, the California market's an important market for the entire Conservancy. You can see how much of our fundraising is going to support California priorities, conservation priorities, versus international and strategy versus other states. So next slide, please. This is it. I'll wrap up here, and then we'll have time for questions, folks. you know, at 3.5 years in, we're doing pretty well. Our planning is certainly paying off, but we still have some major challenges in front of us. You know, our board is very generous in terms of their own giving, but we really have yet to fully engage them in the solicitation process. We don't have term limits is one challenge that maybe some of you can relate to, and many of them were brought on with the understanding that they wouldn't be asked to fundraise. So we still have some work to do to really figure out how to really engage our board in the solicitation process. The second thing I would point out is that we're at the point in the campaign now at 3.5 years in where, you know, we've already harvested most of the low-hanging fruit, meaning we've asked most of the donors who are closest to us to make stretch gifts, and many of them are currently in the middle of paying down multi-year pledges, which is great. But the real challenge now is identifying new major donor prospects and working to get them on an accelerated cultivation and solicitation cycle. And that is some of the hardest work that we do, as you all know. So I will stop there, and I'll turn it back over to you, Craig, or to the group for questions.
All right. Thank you, guys. We have a number of questions, so we'll manage these as time permits. But first would be, what did you do with your annual campaign fundraising during the capital campaign?
So we embedded those asks into campaign asks, was our approach to essentially make a compound kind of gift ask, if you will, for campaign, for annual support, and also where we could for, you know, especially with loyal donors, which we define as people who have given in 8 out of the last 10 years, really making sure that when we're talking to kind of a gift planning target, if you will, that we would build in discussions around complex gifts, different kinds of assets, or in-will, you know, gift planning kinds of asks as well. So we rolled it all up.
I think the challenge too has been, and it's not just for California, but for many of the chapters, is, you know, their program is really an annual, major gift annual program. So it's either an annual ask or it's a project-specific ask that maybe, you know, might be payable over 2 or 3 years. But it's been very specific corner of the world that we buy this piece of land in this corner of the world, and that's where it's very specific where the donations are going. So I think part of the challenge has been, how do we as major gift officers reframe how we approach, cultivate, and ask donors to this much broader concept around the campaign, which is part of their annual as well, but it's a very different approach, and I think that's part of the challenge too.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question is, did you also increase programmatic staffing to implement these programs?
Yes, we did. When we went through the reorg, we realized that we needed to invest in additional conservation and science staffing. I'm not sure what the numbers were exactly on that. It wasn't a tremendous number of program folks, but we did need to build that out as well. And in fact, I appreciate the question. One of the things that we're thinking about right now is, you know, look, we're getting this spike in fundraising for the campaign, but, you know, we will get donor fatigue, and we will come to a point, we may be getting there now, we'll see, where our fundraising is going to drop off. So we have to be really careful about building in, you know, staff, hiring people, because those are, you know, long-term, you know, commitments, and we have to make sure that we can sustain our spending out over the next, you know, 5-10 years. So we've worked closely with our finance team, our conservation and science team. We think about the sustainability of the organization on a 5-year basis. Every year we kind of go through a budget planning process that really looks at that.
Jake, you just touched on it, but you didn't really describe the reorg, because I think it's fascinating what has happened where philanthropy has so influenced the basic fundamental structure of your organization and even how they go about doing business. I think it's very interesting. Meaning reorganizing under your 3 buckets that the development staff came up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so one thing that on the philanthropy side and on the marketing side that we were talking about early in the campaign was, hey, it's okay if our internal organizational structure doesn't perfectly align with our external messaging, right? We need to tell a story and communicate to our donors in a way that is simple and elegant and that's easy to remember and sticky. And, when you've got 3 ecoregions and 6 prime, initiatives, salmon, water, climate, et cetera, and those are all kind of matrixed, and it can get really complex. And that makes sense it can make sense from an organizational management standpoint, but it's not a very good messaging platform. So we were all along saying, hey, that's okay. We can manage that. But what was interesting, though, I think, was, to see the organization really evolve as we moved into the campaign to say, hey, let's actually have let's organize around these big priorities. And I guess one thing I would point out too is, I wouldn't say that it was because of the fundraising campaign, but I think it was part of it was the campaign, but a big part of it as well was that our global organization is organized around land, water, oceans, climate, cities. And so in addition to being consistent with our messaging and our campaign framework, this new structure helped the chapter get more in sync with the global organization, which is always really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And to everyone on the phone, we're just going to keep asking questions. We have a number in the queue, so if we don't get to your question, we'll make sure to touch base afterwards. The next question is how do you make the case for unrestricted gifts? What are you telling a donor about how funds are used?
Yeah, well, I think at the heart of that is the kind of conservation impact that we're talking about having here at the Conservancy. When you're purchasing land and your objective is kind of bucks and acres, if you will, that's a pretty straightforward case to make. And as I try to describe, the Conservancy is really moving through this evolution where protecting places is in our DNA. It's always going to be a part of who we are. Mm-hmm. But what we're really talking about here is solving some of these big hairball environmental challenges that the world is facing. So that requires a whole new set of conservation metrics, right? So what we're telling donors is we're trying to get really clear internally on what exactly will their funding help us accomplish. What are the outcomes we're driving towards? And those may be place-based, but there may be policy reforms, there may be influence strategies where we're influencing the way timber companies or fishermen or farmers kind of work. So the case we've been making for kind of that, if you will, is that this is really, to get those kinds of outcomes, we need to support our core program conservation and science teams. We will deliver to you, a donor, a set of conservation outcomes, and we want to help you, right, the donor, achieve what you're trying to achieve through the Conservancy. So I guess the answer to that is the organization, the operations of the organization are built into a defined set of outcomes that we're working with donors to help them understand and to understand what they want to accomplish. I don't know if I answered that very well. Sorry, folks.
Well, I think the other issue, too, is, what we found was when we talk to the donors, that they really trust the Nature Conservancy. And when we really drilled down on, so we wanted to buck the myth that people felt that we had to be very specific of where their contribution was going. And when we interviewed donors or talked with donors, would you earmark it for this, or this? Most often they said, we trust and believe in the Nature Conservancy, and we would give it unrestricted to the Nature Conservancy. So I think we were inadvertently restricting dollars coming in the door before they needed to be restricted. So many of the conversations are about how do you sell the campaign as a whole, the broader entity. So the first ask would be for a campaign gift, which is broadly restricted for any of the initiatives under there. The fallback position would be asking for broadly restricted for one of those three buckets. And then if the donor still wouldn't go there, then we can drill down even farther. But often we see, especially in the early phases of the campaign, people that are closest to the organization really believe in the organization and will give a broadly restricted gift at those levels.
Excellent. This is a question regarding campaign counting guidelines, but were they adjusted for the campaign? Were your campaign counting guidelines adjusted for the campaign?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think it was regarding the campaign dashboard that indicated that you count verbal pledges towards your campaign goal.
We have pretty strict counting guidelines. We do count verbal pledges as long as we do count those, and we count gift intentions. Maybe you all are seeing a lot of this as well because so many of our donors are giving through donor advised funds, and they're not allowed to make pledges against donor advised funds, but they can write out an intention to give, so we do count that as well. And we are counting membership in the door. We're counting realized bequests, and we are counting the number of in-will notifications. I think our accounting guidelines are pretty consistent with standards and norms. I could be wrong.
Okay, thank you. And this question is just talking about the length of total time or total length of time from the strategic plan, analytics, and portfolio rebalancing, case materials, the campaign quiet phase, and the public phase.
Yeah. So we're not in the public phase yet, but we launched. So we received approval from the board in May of 2014. We started counting towards the campaign. We started talking about the campaign with our board and raising gifts prior to that. So our official time frame is July 1, 2013 through June 2018. And we will extend that, is what it looks like. And it took us probably 18 months to really hit our stride and get up to speed to where we had the materials and the approval from the board and all of that. I'd say probably about 18 months. Does that sound right to you, Craig?
Yeah, there was a lot of front-end work on this campaign, and I think that's why you've had as good a success as you have. But they really spent the time needed, and they didn't rush into the campaign. And I think the other factor was they were so much farther ahead of the World Office, who was gearing up for a campaign at the time, that it kind of bought them a little bit of time also, I think, to do a little more preparation, and then eventually kind of lined up with the national organization.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. Well, I think we are officially out of time. There were a number of questions that we just weren't able to get to, but we do promise to get to them after our webinar, so stay tuned. But a big thank you to Craig and Jake for sharing with us this wonderful story. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. If you do have any questions, please let us know. And look forward to our next webinar, which I guess is on May 10th, and that is covering fundraising communications and fundraising materials that work. So that may certainly be of interest to those of you on the phone. And from all of us at Campbell & Company, we hope that you have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.